Hello, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Today we're honoured to be in the company of one of Australia's foremost men of letters, the incomparable Mr. Frank Moorhouse. Frank, as I'm sure you all know, looms so large on the Australian literary stage that when he finally croaks, and we hope that won't be for a good while yet, I've heard that they're going to stuff him and stick him on a pedestal by Sydney Opera House as a sort of lighthouse for the ferries coming into Circular Quay. But it's not a bad literary image, actually, even though I say so myself, because Frank has been a sort of beacon for writers for many decades now. Now Frank and I will talk about his life and times and work, but you lovely people also have a role to play here, and I just want to overrule what the young lady just said, because these sessions go much better when you guys join in and ask questions, and I don't like to leave it until 10 minutes at the end when everybody's desperate to get a question in and everybody runs out of time. So be ready with your questions, and we'll come to you after a few minutes. And there will be a prize for the person who's brave enough to ask the first question. The prize will be, hang on. The prize will be 10,000 rupiah. Not yet. We haven't started yet. I haven't said go yet. Okay, Frank. Novelist, essayist, memoirist, short story writer, screenwriter, journalist. You used to write books like this. Okay. Now, you write books you have to bring in on a truck. What happened?
That's right. That's what happened.
What happened?
I obviously became verbose. Yes, I remember when I was 20. I don't know, somewhere when my first book came out in my late 20s. I said on the book jacket, I said I am a short story writer and proud of it, and I have no intention of writing a novel. That's how much we know about our future. So I began as a short story writer and published quite young in the literary magazines. I'd always loved the short story. At a lunch sometime in the long period of the long lunch in Australia, when I was about 20 years on from there, I said to Donald Horne, one of our great writers and historians, I said, Donald, I made this pledge that I would never write a novel, and I claimed to be a short story writer, and here I am breaking the rules of my pledge to the world and to the short story and to the muses. And he said, "That's easy." He said, "Kneel down," and I knelt down, and he put his hand on my head and said, "You are no longer a short story writer. You're a writer." And then I stood up. I was released from the pledge. There was a certain dishonesty in describing myself as a short story writer, because right very early on I realized, first of all, that we were taught at school, I think everyone here probably still is taught, that the short story is a freestanding, autonomous work of fiction that bears no relation, it's not a chapter. It's a freestanding work. But I realized at some point in my 20s that my stories did link up, and I kept changing the names of the characters in the short stories, even though they were the same characters earlier. And I was writing about the same milieu, a sort of bohemian class, and a type of new awareness that was occurring in lots of Western countries, the liberation which was running through Western countries in the 60s and into the 70s, where censorship was being opposed, and various sorts of models of morality were being challenged, and women were stating their claim, and other minorities. Sorry, and the minorities. And the minorities, I'm sorry. That's right. In fact, last time I looked at the statistics, you were the majority. What took you so long? I realised that the stories were linked, and then when I published my first book in my late 20s, many of those pieces had started as short stories, and I was asked by the new publisher, a young publisher, and he said, well, what do we call this? He said, it's not a novel, but the stories are linked and the characters recur and so on. And I said, I call it a discontinuous narrative. And I just had made it up. I made it up there and then at that lunch. And he said, that's brilliant, and that describes exactly what you're doing, and it's a discontinuous narrative.
You just stole,
I was working with I was working with the short story and using it as parts of a larger structure, and it was a very loose structure, but the stories reverberated. But at some point, I moved then to, in fact, all the books from the first book to the last book, which is Dark Palace, there's 14 books I've written. In fact, there are characters that appear in these big novels that were in some of the short stories.
Edith is in here.
Right? That's right.
Your heroine,
in there, and T. George McDowell was in my third book, and he appears. So the books are also linked.
Can you tell us, Frank, a little bit about the League of Nations trilogy? I believe these are the first two books in the trilogy, and I believe you're just about to complete the third, are you? Are you not?
Yes, I'm just completing the third of these. These are historically based, research-based novels set at the old League. These two are set at the old League of Nations before the Second World War, which was the forerunner of the United Nations. The League of Nations was started in 1920, and it was seen as the hope of the world, of course. It was the first attempt at international organisation of this scale, aimed at preventing war, solving questions of hunger and famine, questions dealing with international disasters and cross-border issues. And it also had as its aim to disarm the world to the level of police forces. And the centrepiece of the League of Nations work in the 1920s and 1930s was a disarmament conference in 1931. There'd been 7 years of planning, and this conference, all the nations of the world attended this conference, aimed at phasing out all major armies and major navies and air forces, and reducing all armaments down to the level of police forces. And of course, in 1933, Hitler was elected to power, and that changed the nature of the world. So in many ways, the League of Nations was seen as the greatest embarrassment of the 20th century, and certainly some people would say the greatest example of the incapacity of the human species to resolve its conflicts and hostilities through international cooperation and dealing. Commentators at the time suggested maybe that we're not bright enough, or as my character says, Edith Campbell-Berry says, in many ways the League of Nations was the school we all went to, or the world went to school, and that we're still going to school on this subject.
Frank, in researching these books, you undertook a huge task, a research task, and spent many, many hours and months probably in libraries, especially in Europe and in Canberra as well. Right?
Yes. Sorry. Oh,
actually,
that's
not the question.
more.
I'm just warming you up. So, when you have in books like this, there's a reliance on historical documents, obviously to a large extent, but a historical documents can only take you so far, and then your imagination has to take over. So, what happens when your imagination clashes with the facts? How do you handle if you find something in the research that doesn't fit your story.
Yes, I think I could just read out one of the sorts of mission statements a mission statement that I make at the beginning of this book, which I won't try to paraphrase, but I say that this book is in part based on the dramatic reconstruction of real people identified by their actual names and on fictional characters who sometimes embody features of people who existed at the time but who are essentially fictional. And then I say, see who is who at the back of the book. Where people who actually existed say anything substantial, their words are taken from documentary sources or are constructed within the context of existing evidence. All the substantial events depicted, and quite a few of the insubstantial events, are inspired by documentary sources. But, I say, the book is, above all, a work of the imagination. Now, that's a mission statement, and it's full of complexity, as you've just said. One of the strange things that I learned while working off documents and creating fictional characters and intermingling them with real people who actually existed was that the narrative had an undertow. It was like a tide. The narrative had a pull of its own, and it constructed itself almost with a momentum that was almost beyond my control. And in some cases, I had to make a note at the back of the book, just out of a couple of notes at the back of the book saying there was no Swiss Secretary General, acting Secretary General or Under Secretary General of the League of Nations, but I have one in the book. There's a Swiss, and that allowed me certain ways of manoeuvring. And in some cases I said the conference on population was in fact 3 years later, but these I just make notes there are lots of notes at the back, but it just illustrates that the imagination has a remarkable power even in research-based books. And the characters are obviously telling a story which goes places, and you must have heard this as readers and writers yourselves, heard many people say that the characters take over the book, and it's a truism, but it's a very strange business, and getting them to obey history is sometimes a bit of a struggle.
I wanted to ask, in the League of Nations trilogy, your heroine is Edith Campbell-Berry. The question is it easy for you to write from the female point of view?
Yes, that's right. That's right. The books are written from the point of view of a young Australian woman who goes to Geneva wanting a career in international diplomacy. Most countries of the world at that point did not use women in the role of in international diplomacy in departments of foreign affairs and so on. But the League of Nations in 1920 had a equal opportunity a covenant. In the covenant had one of the clauses states that that women will be considered for all positions in the League of Nations, and many young women flocked to the League of Nations with the hope of getting into international diplomacy. No woman rose high. Only the whole organisation was broken down into sections. Very health and disarmament and migration and so on, and mandates, but only health and only the soft section or department was run by a woman, and only one woman rose to section head. But there were quite a few other women, and especially young women from all over the world, who got into various parts of the organisation at various other levels. And my character does. In some ways, again, it sounds a bit disingenuous for me to say it. I didn't really decide to use her point of view in any rational way. as Stephen pointed out, I'd already written some chapters about the character she was a minor player in my book 4017. But in 4017, she says, I was once an officer at the League of Nations. No one pays any attention to her in the book in 4017. So I thought I'd make them pay attention to her by writing these books.
There's a body I want to mention. You just use the word rational. You talk about the Rationalist Association. Now, this is a fascinating organisation, I think, because isn't that just what we need today? In this, the theme of this festival is harmony and diversity. So, isn't this exactly what we need today at a time of growing religious fundamentalism, and not just in the Middle East? I'm talking about the Bible Belt in the United States. Wouldn't it be great to have a Rationalist Association again?
The Rationalist Association was a body set up by the intellectuals of mainly in England and other English-speaking countries.
Bertrand Russell, I think, was one of the members.
Yeah, and H.G. Wells and all those people, and Bernard Shaw. And it was set up to... in fact, I think at the back of each of these volumes I have its mission statement, and Rationalism stated their position as the adoption of those mental attitudes which unreservedly accept the supremacy of reason and aimed at establishing a system of philosophy and ethics verifiable by experience and independent of all arbitrary assumptions of authority. And Einstein and all sorts of important people joined it, and it was a movement. And my character is partly comes out of a rationalist family and a rationalist tradition, as did some other serious Australians. But I just wanted to answer more fully Stephen's question about writing from the female point of view. The other thing is that my therapist said to me that Freud said that our personalities are an argument between the mother and father for control of our personalities, and that this argument goes on in our unconscious mind, and a constant argument. And the therapist pointed to these two books and said, "Well, that's the book about my father is called that's based on his generation. Is called The Electrical Experience, and it's that size, and that's the size of my two books that would represent who we can see who won the argument in me." And in many ways, I gave a voice to my mother, who was active in public life, and given different circumstances, she would have gone into exactly this pathway. But about the fictional challenge and the authority, on what authority does a male write about females, apart from the psychoanalytic explanation, I think when we stand back from it, in many ways it makes sense. It's rational, if you like, that in many ways heterosexual men, experience women, many more women, and experience women intimately, and women experience men, heterosexual women experience men intimately, and quite a few, whether it be through brothers and whether it be through marriages and lovers. So we do have given access to each other's gender through the natural course of life. And it can be, and we observe each other closely.
Somebody must have a question about all that.
I'm still intrigued why you wrote a book, two books about international relations, which I frankly think are some of the best fiction that's ever been written about international relations. It's probably the only fiction that's been written on a really grand scale, but it's brilliantly done. And what really intrigues me is how someone, with your previous literary and personal background, Royce Christopher and all that sort of stuff, somehow plunges all of a sudden into this deeply serious and really quite moving and really very intuitively brilliant writing about international relations. I mean, there's a lot of the Royster's Bohemian stuff tucked away there as well, and the club life and all the rest of it. And I can see why you got intrigued with the character, Edith, and wanted to develop it. But it really was a huge transformation, wasn't it, to plunge into this kind of intellectual subject matter universe, and why and how?
The small. Why did it take so long? I've spent about 18 years on the three. When this third volume comes out, I will have spent about 18 years on and off on the project. And each of these two volumes took about 4 years or so, 5 years to write. And I spent about 4 years in the League of Nations archive in Geneva, and then I also worked in the Library of Congress, and I was given a writer in residency at Cambridge University at King's College to spend a year working there on their holdings, and so on. But Gareth, isn't it? Gareth. I'm honoured to have you here. I'm glad that you're on my side and not a critic today. You'd be the most powerful critic in the room, I think, although I suppose there might be some others here. And you're certainly one I wouldn't like to have to tangle with on the other side. It's true that the earlier books were about my milieu and about growing up and all the things that writers deal with, and always freshly, and I hope with new approaches as the generations proceed and things change. I think the most I certainly came from a family that talked politics and public affairs from the conservative side. The other major experience in my development, I was then a journalist for a few years, and naturally got to know a bit about the various levels of government and about the legal systems. I then worked as I then went into adult education as an organizer and as an administrator, and I spent 5 years with an organisation called the Workers' Educational Association, which was a British organisation. It was one of the first adult education bodies set up in the early 20th century to mainly to open up university-level education to those who could not afford or had not qualified to go to university, and to make it free and to make it accessible to and the trade union movements of Australia and most of the Commonwealth countries had a Workers' Educational Association. I joined that organisation as I say, as an administrator, and in many ways the WEA was a living, a museum. By the time I joined it in the 60s, it's still a wonderful organisation. It still functions, but they don't mention the word workers, and some people have argued that it should be called the Women's Educational Association. Of course, a lot of the people who go are women. But the organisation was in many ways a living. It was out of the pre-Second World War world. There were rationalists and atheists and pacifists and all the representatives of the pre-Second World War world were present in living evidence and in the old WEA. I was in my 20s, and these people were all pre-war people who'd been educated in their experiences. So it was an amazing brush, or was 5 years, that I mixed with people who, and the WEA in many ways was like the League of Nations. But then I had done political science and history as an undergraduate, and I had been edging towards writing about, by 2017 I was edging towards looking at international politics. And at the back of my head, I thought one day I will be ready and able to somehow get back to the League of Nations which I was curious about. I was curious about, because as a high school kid I thought, why in God's name didn't the world resolve its problems instead of having another war, another world war? It seemed, as a high school student, it seemed to me to require some answers. Later on, in my 40s, some point I decided that now was the time, and I was given a substantial fellowship for 3 years to embark on this project. And that took me to Geneva, where I went, and I thought I allocated 3 months to look at the archive and to research. And then I spent another 3 months, and then another 3 months, and then another 3 months, and I ended up spending 4 years there. And I'm still, I've moved on from the League of Nations a bit, but I'm still working with this material and developing it. But I often think that that WEA experience was extraordinarily important. Of course, it also gave me a experience with administration and committee work and so on. And then, of course, I took other opportunities to visit peacekeeping organisations as a quasi-journalist, and I visited the Middle East, and I exposed myself to a number of situations where international diplomatic action was working out on the ground.
Now, I know that deep down, way down in your soul somewhere, all of you Aussies really want to be Poms. I know that you all want to be British, really. So, There was a time I think it was in the 50s in Australia, when people like Clive James and Germaine Greer were leaving Australia for England to go to university and then pursue writing careers and what have you. And Clive James talks about it in Unreliable Memoirs. So I'm wondering why you and other writers of your time, and you must be contemporaries of some of those people, why did you decide to stay in Australia and not take the boat?
Yeah, I'm not a contemporary, actually, of Clive James and Germaine and so on. They were the last, let's leave Peter Carey to one side, they were the last two of the Australians intelligentsia and literary world and the arts world to feel that you could not develop as an intellectual or as an artist by staying in a country of 8 million people or 7 whatever when they left, 8 million, with limited facilities and limited cultural resources, and that the best thing was to get the hell out, and many of them did get the hell out, but my generation was the first in the arts, I think, to say, no, I think now, this was after the election of the Whitlam government, and the huge cultural and social revolution that occurred in the 60s and 70s, and feminism and the whole change in the mood and quality of discourse in Australia occurred in that period, and most of us then decided that we didn't discuss this, but we individually decided to pretty much stay at home and work and do our work from Australia. Of course, there were hundreds of great examples of, I mean, God, what was the size of London and England or Stratford when Shakespeare wrote it? He didn't go abroad, and he worked in a population, I don't know, probably a smaller population, 5-8 million in England at that time. So there were other examples. Faulkner did all his writing in Mississippi. I mean, for God's sake, I don't know why any of us ever thought that you had to go to London and New York to be a writer or an intellectual.
Having embarked on your career as a writer, you upset a few people back home by becoming embroiled in some literary controversies, which you might expand on in a minute. But my question is, are you, just to play devil's advocate again for a minute, having been a revolutionary and firebrand at first, you're now a member of the Order of Australia. And it sounds like from that you might have been co-opted by the establishment. So I'm wondering whether you've gone soft.
I don't know whether I was a firebrand. I was a writer of my generation, and one of the things that preoccupied us was what we used to call the sexual revolution. We were concerned with the whole what the generation was redefining what it meant to be a man and what it meant to be a woman. It also was redefining relationships between children and their parents. It was redefining the relationships of the state and the church and its roles in setting morality and telling us what to do in the bedroom. So I was a person of my times, and it wasn't, and we didn't think that we were ever going to change the world, and we were being censored and we were being kicked around, and we were having trouble getting our work published because of the content. But then, and we never dreamed at first that there was going to be a total change of the in the attitude in the society at large. And in 1973, for instance, the Whitlam government abolished censorship of the written word, of the published word, and that was no one was more surprised than the writers when this happened, and the readers. I mean, Australia was the most censored country in the world outside Ireland and Iran. It was the list of censored books was Ulysses, Lady Chatterley's Lover, right through D.H. Lawrence. Oh, it was. I often, sometimes when I've been asked to talk about this period, I think, God, it couldn't have been that bad, and I go back to some of the sources like Peter Coleman's book on censorship in Australia, which was published in the 60s, and I just remind myself of how censored Australia was and how morally policed it was.
Am I right in thinking that you couldn't even find out which books you weren't allowed to buy because the list was secret?
Yes, you couldn't find out what the books were, and you'd be your luggage would be searched when you came back from, not for drugs. Your luggage would be searched for banned books. It's unbelievable.
I think you tweeted something there when you were talking about how bad it was. It's a period before my time. I guess I grew up becoming conscious of Australia when it was getting liberal, and now in my life story it feels like it's almost a reversion a little bit. And when you talked about the list of books that you couldn't even know about, it reminded me of a controversy recently about the internet filter that was being talked about. I'm just wondering how you feel the cycle is going.
I'm pretty vigilant. I think one of the things that one of the roles of writers is to be and people in the arts is to be a canary, if you like, in the coal mine. But we're also tend to be rather vigilant. Those of us who experience censorship are rather vigilant about what movements are occurring in the society. And there has been a slight retreat from full freedom of expression, and the censorship that was introduced in the last 10 years under the Howard government, and most of which still exists, but it is not exercised, has been about publication of radical Islamic material, and there's been and we said, if you're going to have freedom of expression, you have freedom of expression for radical Muslims as well. The sexual issues are not as strong, but of course the internet's has opened up another whole question which I wouldn't quite go into now. But I'm obviously part of the push back against any sort of government censorship of the internet. I think the internet is one of the most complete pictures of the human consciousness that we've ever had. It's the most unbridled and untrammeled assemblage of the human consciousness. the National Library, and probably every library in the world, and the National Library of Australia, takes snapshots and preserves them of what's on. It just does a scan through what's, I think, for a day every year or something, to just record exactly what's on the internet. But it's getting beyond, probably beyond that, and it's ugly, and it's perhaps even dangerous in parts, but of course it's incredible and amazing and extraordinary. Just returning a little to the League of Nations, there's I talked about the sort of research I did with the archives, but one of the pieces of research I really want to talk to you about and share just very briefly is that I was at dinner in Besançon, where I was living in France, and there was a dinner. I was invited to a dinner party, and people said, "What are you doing?" And I told them, and I said that in fact there were some Canadians at this dinner party, and I said to them, in fact, one of the people that whose career path I've used for my character is a Canadian officer at the League of Nations called Mary McGeechee. And I used her career path by going back through her records, personnel records and so on, to see what a woman could actually achieve and how far she could get and what obstacles she encountered and so on. And Mary McGeechee left a huge paper trail of arguments within the organisation. They said, "That's funny, we know a McGeechee family in London, Ontario," and they said they could be related, and I said, "Probably." And about 3 or 4 months later, I get a letter from these Canadians saying, the woman whose career path you're writing about is still alive. And I thought, that can't be right. I studied the League of Nations in high school in the 1950s. There's no one. And then I thought, well, yes, of course there could be people alive who were with the League. And then I thought, I rang the United Nations pensions office, because I knew that the United Nations had picked up the pensions, paid the pensions for people who'd worked at the League. And I said, "Do you have any League people still on the pension payroll?" And they came back to me and said, "Only one, Mary McGeechee." I was living in France, and I found out, I was told that she was living in upstate New York with her adopted daughter and son-in-law. I jumped on a plane, flew to Montreal, I think, rented a car and drove down to upstate New York to Keene Valley, a village in upstate New York. I went and I decided before I went that I wouldn't write and ask if it was all right for me to come, because I thought they might say she's too old, she's too frail, she's lost her mind, whatever. And they might have said, "No, it's not convenient, and who the hell are you?" So I what is called a cold, what is it called? A cold call. I arrived and I knocked on the door, and the daughter-in-law answered the door, and I explained what I was going to do, what I wanted. I wanted to talk to her mother, or her. She was adopted. And they said, "Oh, no, you've got the wrong Mary McGeechee. This woman has never been associated with the League of Nations." And I said, "Well, can you check with her?" They didn't actually quite know she didn't quite know what the League of Nations was. And she said, "Well, we'll get back to you." And then next day I rang, or I called again, and they said, "Yes, you're right. We didn't know our mother had been an officer in the League of Nations."
How old was she at this point?
She was in her 90s. Mary McGeechee, she was in her 90s. And they said, "Yes, come in and talk to her." And she's frail, and she's broken her leg, and she's in bed, and she's bedridden. And I went in, and I thought, my God, this is going over and clutching her, holding her hand was like being drawn back through the mirror of history. And she was on the bed. She had Le Monde and the Wall Street Journal. She was following the war that's the first Gulf War, and It was one of the most moving experiences I've had as a writer was to actually touch base with someone who, from all my attitude had been that this was long gone and that this organisation had disappeared, not only like the Titanic. It was like the Titanic, it had gone down to the bottom of history, and the UN had airbrushed it out. He was the living survivor of that time, of the lead. It was like finding someone alive in the Titanic. And her short-term memory was lost. Every day I had to reintroduce myself. She sometimes, I had a pile of documents and photographs to stimulate her, but she would look at these and sometimes come up with some information, but she eventually, on the second day, she said, "Mr. Moorhouse, you must, I don't know, I can't recall my life, you must tell me my life. And tell me again what I did and who I was then." And I thought, my God, this is reversed research. This is not me taking from her. I gave her back a life, and I spent more than a week, 2 weeks, talking to her about what she did and reading out things that she did, and she would smile and sometimes she would remember. But basically, I not only gave her back. She died about 3 months after I visited her, but I also gave her family a whole family history that they didn't know anything about. And she'd been she'd been only a middle-ranking administrator in the League, but went on to be the first woman to be appointed in the British Foreign Office as a publicist, but at that level, but the first woman during the Second World War in the British Foreign Office.
Frank, that's a wonderful story on which to finish. Unfortunately, we're out of time, or we've overrun already. So a big hand, please, for Mr. Frank Moorhouse. Thank you. Oh, that's amazing. That is an amazing story. Yeah.